All right, so I'll pass around the sign-in sheet and we can get going. Oh. All right, so today we'll focus primarily on the Cold War / civil rights. Usually the Cold War and civil rights are treated as two separate sort of semantic fields, as it were. But I think it's important to cover them both together in a global context. And you'll see that the Cold War and civil rights are really fueling each other in fundamental ways. Of course, we'll look at a lot of ads as well. So the Cold War begins with Harry Truman as president, right at the end of World War II. You might remember that FDR died during the war. Truman was his vice president, took over. So an important thing to keep in mind is that, you know, the Cold War, of course, goes from the end of World War II to '89 when the Berlin Wall falls. But the Cold War is also synonymous with the post-colonial period in American history. So Europeans pretty much colonized all of Africa, almost all of Asia, as well as the Americans colonizing parts of Asia as well. But after World War II, Britain and France, in particular, their economies are in shambles, their military is really on the wane. And all of these nations throughout here, like the British, French, Belgians, etc., they start to really sort of let their colonies go. And this creates a competition between the two remaining superpowers, the Americans and the Soviets, to bring these post-colonial nations into their sphere of orbit, their sphere of influence, to essentially make political partnerships with them, economic partnerships. So remember, this is very sort of intertwined to what's happening with the civil rights movement at home as well. Anyone know what the Marshall Plan is? Remember? Marshall Plan? Anyone? Yeah, go ahead.
So an economic recovery package sponsored by the U.S. that basically sent aid to, you know, European and then later Asian states that were affected by World War II.
Yeah, exactly. So what was the rationale?
Well, the rationale was if we help them rebuild, that they can sort of be more pertinent allies and be a bulwark against communism. And the idea also was that if they don't rebuild, there's a higher chance of radicals as well. And
yeah, good. And sort of what would the memory of World War I be in the Marshall Plan as well?
Well, yeah, the rationale was without the support and the economic recovery and other economic recession that was the internal weak, the rise of like another totalitarian ideology.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the lessons from World War I was that if you don't sort of make friends with the people you just went to war with and integrate their economies into your own economy, you're going to have another sort of Weimar Republic, which would lead to Hitler, etc. So good. So essentially the US makes allies of the Germans and Japanese economic trading partners, political partners, things of that nature, which is really a watershed in world history. Never before had someone sort of like beat their opponent in a war and then became sort of like best friends with them right after. So also the Cold War is the era of containment policy. You sort of get what's being illustrated in this ad. You have the Russian there. You need to sort of like stop the Russians from spreading their influence any more than they already have, which is, you know, containment policy, of course. There's a major flashpoint, 1948-49, the Germans blockade Berlin. Berlin after the war was split into different spheres of influence between the British, Americans, and Russians. But the Russians in 1948 blockaded. This is ultimately ended by the US with what were called candy bombers. They would sort of like just drop millions of pounds worth of supplies behind the blockade. So it sort of rendered the Russians' blockade of Berlin useless, and they abandoned it after 11 months, and the city goes back to being split in two. The Korean War from 1950 to 53 is a good example of containment policy. The North has a heavy communist influence from China and the Soviet Union, backed by the Soviet Union. And the South is largely backed by the US. It ends, as I said, in 1953. You can see the headline here. It's split in two. at the 38th parallel, which creates a DMZ zone, a demilitarized zone right in the middle, and it still remains this way today. The Rosenbergs were killed in 1953. Anybody know who the Rosenbergs are? Go ahead, Sam.
They were a Jewish American couple who were executed for supplying nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and the whole notion that the U.S. doesn't want to fight the Russians today in Ukraine is because we don't want to like start a war with another nuclear power. And I've been wondering recently, like what, if the Russians would have ever developed the nuclear weapon had it not been for, the Rosenbergs sort of passing along secrets. It's amazing how sort of like something these two people did in 1953 can shape history, like world history, so many years later. So I've just been thinking about the Rosenbergs a lot lately. But also remember last week or the week before when we watched the Mad Men things, one of the people on the Mad Men clip says that like Ethel Rosenberg wore lipstick to the electric chair, which is true, she did. So McCarthyism happens from 1950 to 54. Anyone want to take a stab at what McCarthyism was? What's so essential to American history? Go ahead.
It was Senator McCarthy from, I want to say, actually, I'm not even going to have
Wisconsin.
I was going to say Wyoming.
Okay, close. W.
W's confused me. And he called upon dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of people to come before the Senate to essentially put them on trial for treason if they were suspected in any way of treason, which was supporting communism or reading about communism. There were certain magazines that you would be jailed for having in your home. People would, there was a list of people who got blacklisted in Hollywood because they would give out the names of people who, had talked to a person from the Soviet Union or who had had Russian literature in their home.
Yeah, or had been in the Communist Party in the 1930s.
Yeah, it was like very much a paranoia that got people jailed and their lives destroyed. Yeah,
it was actually like the damage that this guy wrought from the paranoia, as you say, was much worse than anything the Russians could have possibly been doing at the time. So it's like an enemy within. And also in academia, there was all kinds of, suspected leftists who were purged. There was something called the lavender, something having to do with lavender, where a whole bunch of homosexuals were sort of like forced out of federal jobs, out of academia. So it's sort of conflated with homosexuality with communism as well. Arthur Miller, Marilyn Monroe's husband, writes this really, important play in 1953 called The Crucible. It's about the Salem witch trials, but really it's about McCarthyism, what's happening at the time. You have, as Isla pointed out, sort of like a purge of suspected communists or leftists from Hollywood. You can see in this ad here, it's sort of like, trying to sort of scare people off from the leftists who might be feeding your kids, a diet of leftism as they're watching cartoons or whatever. Charlie Chaplin, you'll recall that we watched some Charlie Chaplin videos throughout the course of the semester. He had like a very leftist bent, grew up very poor. So, his struggle to survive when he was a kid really played itself out in a lot of his videos, such as The Tramp, Modern Times, which was the one we looked at. And he's forced out of the US during this time period as well. And you see all of these ad campaigns, these like so-called public service announcements where it's, basically trying to scare your kids off of communism or scare you into thinking that communism has completely infiltrated society. And you can see just sort of like some of the grounds that it's cultural groups. So like, remember all those like New Deal era plays and things like that, like Upton Sinclair's It Can Happen Here from Congress's publications. So it's basically saying like, the guy's apologizing to his child for not realizing how pervasive communism had become in all of these sort of institutions of American life. You get all of these like little pamphlets that are being created by organizations such as the John Birch Society. And again, it's all sort of like trying to scare parents that like their kids are being infected with communism and things like that. This one here, same thing, Little Red Schoolhouse, like the fear of your teachers being leftists or communists and turning your kids into leftists or communists. There's this magazine Legion that comes out, and they have this whole expose on homosexual leftist professors who are trying to turn your kids into gay communists. You have this sort of strange one of like, this is what America is under socialism, the factory shut down. You would think that in a socialist state, the factory would always be running, so I'm not really sure about the logic with this one. And again, this came out in 1960, this notion that, you know, the USA is heading for this sort of like Titanic collapse with communism being spread all throughout the world. And then this is, I think, is an interesting comic book that came out. Is This Tomorrow, America Under Communism? And you can sort of see the racial dynamics. So like the black guy's a communist, the Chinese guy's a communist, the communists are attacking women. This old white man is sort of like giving it to this guy. So yeah, there's, as we'll see throughout the course of today, there's a real racialization of communism that takes place too, especially as civil rights becomes more central to American society. This, I think, is an interesting ad, really sort of interesting social tableau about, you know, if the business owner doesn't buy Scott towels for the restroom, you could turn your workers communists. I guess like if the toilet paper is too harsh or something, it's gonna like turn them into communists. Very strange ad. And of course, movies during this time period, there's a real prevalence of sort of anti-communist Red Scare type movies. The Red Menace. This is about sort of you know, communists infiltrating American society and the people you least expect. I Married a Communist. This has that like femme fatale vibe that was so popular during the 40s. The residue of it still exists in the 50s, and you know, you have to watch out for the woman who might turn you into a communist. And this one too, My Son John, has similar themes. In 1959, The Manchurian Candidate first comes out as a book. It's basically about veterans of the Korean War who were brainwashed. There was like a lot of paranoia about the brainwashing of soldiers during this time period, because you would have the Koreans sending videos of American soldiers like saying how wrong they were to be there and things like that. And so the American State Department tells the public that like, well, they must have been brainwashed to sort of like turn on their country like this. So that's a major theme where this guy who was brainwashed by the Koreans comes to like assassinate the American president. It becomes a really popular movie in 1962 starring Frank Sinatra. It's been said that sci-fi is always sort of like about the anxieties of the day. So has anybody seen Black Mirror on Netflix? So that's like very sort of like sci-fi. So what's the fear in Black Mirror a lot of times? Go ahead.
It's like a commentary on how technology is basically treated as like dystopia.
Yeah, exactly. So back then the dystopia was the notion of sort of like space invaders or body snatchers or something like that. And of course, like the body snatchers or the aliens are usually stand-ins for the Soviets invading the United States. So then another popular one where you have these like sort of like, you know, insects infiltrating your society and destroying it. The insects in this would be the Russians. Ronald Reagan, he was a New Deal Democrat until World War II. In 1947, he names names, as it's called. He gives a list of suspected leftists and communists in Hollywood to the House Un-American Activities, HUAC. And he really sort of like rebrands himself after the war as a staunch anti-communist conservative. So I'll play you a quick Reagan commercial, anti-communist commercial.
To the crusade for freedom. Made possible the World Freedom Bell, symbol of hope and freedom to the communist-dominated peoples of Eastern Europe, and built this powerful 135,000-watt Radio Free Europe transmitter in Western Germany. The crusade for freedom is your chance and mine to fight communism. Join now by sending your contributions to General Clay, Crusade for Freedom, Empire State Building, New York City. All roads lead to Hollywood.
Yes, and that's like quintessentially capitalist, right? You're afraid of communism, so send us money to fight them. Ayn Rand becomes a real prominent philosopher of conservative circles. In the 1950s, she has this famous book published in 1957, if I remember correctly, called Atlas Shrugged. And it's all about basically the best thing you can be is selfish and sort of like not care about other people's whims or needs. That she basically argues that everyone is essentially an animal and you're fighting for limited resources. So the notion that you would care about like what your neighbor is doing or like you should care about helping poor people is actually sort of like detrimental to society as a whole. So she, puts a fundamental existentialist question at the center of American life and American politics. And that question is, are humans just, as Rand argues, animals competing for limited resources or something more noble and high-minded? So I'm just interested in how you guys would answer the question. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer, I don't think. It's an existential question. So are humans just animals or are something other than that? Nobody wants to answer? Oh, all right.
Humans are not animals. They're human, but they do have primarily instincts, which are related back maybe to like their animal ancestors in the animal kingdom, probably. And whenever there's like a dangerous like outcome that's happening in society, like they would return to those primal instincts because like they need to survive and they go crazy. So something like that.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I feel like, we're a living thing, just like every other creature, I guess, around, but while we are one of, I guess, the most, smartest living things out there, just like the whale and dolphin, I don't think that she's necessarily wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, I get what she's saying. Like, it's kind of like initially survival of the fittest. Like, you can do things you're able to. But the thing is saying, like, animals are initially competing with a source of limited resources. They're not like able to build things like compassion or something. Yeah. That's kind of wrong because like there are animals, like especially wild animals, that do feel sympathy. And I can't listen to any. I know wolves are fun.
Yeah.
But like, while we might be able to do things with our full thumbs and be able to actually, speech and all that, like saying that we're just savages, right?
Yeah. Anyone else want to add to it? So essentially what Ayn Rand's arguing is that this whole Enlightenment era notion of the social contract is actually like bad for society, that we should abandon the social contract. And you get the sense that there's like a real like free market type of rationale to her thinking as well, that like if you just leave things alone, everything will function more properly. And again, this is coming off of New Deal liberalism, sort of like big government. And there's, in the post-war period, an increasing rejection of this sort of like big government New Deal liberalism. But what's really brilliant about the Republicans' branding of themselves in the post-war period is that they successfully brand themselves as like the party of Jesus, who's like the embodiment or personification of the social contract. I mean, what's Jesus famous for in world history?
Do unto others.
Do unto others, right? What's the sacrifice that Jesus made? He died on the cross to save all of you from eternal hellfire. So he's the personification of the social contract, and Ayn Rand also becomes sort of like central to Republican thinking, the rejection of the social contract. So essentially the Republicans rebrand themselves to appeal to these two sort of like antithetical types of people. So it's essentially like a yin and yang type of branding. So really successful, obviously. So after the Truman era, we have the Eisenhower era from 53 to 61. Richard Nixon is, of course, Eisenhower's vice president. Joseph Stalin is by far the US and Eisenhower's greatest adversary during this time period. The Russians developed the hydrogen bomb, which is sort of like, many times what an atomic bomb is in terms of destruction. So a really powerful sort of bargaining chip in, world diplomacy. You have France. France colonizes Vietnam in 1885, but by the 1950s, they're really struggling to keep it as a colony. There's a real sort of like communist uprising led by this guy, Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh actually expects the Americans to support him in this anti-colonial effort because, of course, the US had been an anti-colonial force throwing off the shackles of British imperialism. So Ho Chi Minh sees a lot of similarities between what the Americans went through and what the Vietnamese were going through. What he didn't sort of like quite understand, I don't think, is that by the time the war ends, World War II ends, the Americans have essentially become a world power on par to what the British were in the 1700s. So domino theory is a rationale sort of similar to containment theory. It's this notion that if Vietnam falls and Laos would fall, then all of Asia would become communist, which is sort of like a rationale for this containment theory. You have to prevent the dominoes from falling, so to speak. The French are finally pushed out of Vietnam at Dien Bien Phu. The French paratrooper a whole bunch of troops, I think 16,000 if I remember correctly, into this sort of valley at Dien Bien Phu. The Viet Cong surround them and basically have them in their firing lines. The French asked the Americans to drop an atomic bomb on the communists here. The Americans refused to do it, so France really has no choice really but to pull out of Vietnam, and the U.S. sort of takes control of the south of Vietnam during that time period. Just like with Korea, you have the partition of the two countries into a communist north and a American-led south. You also have during this time period a new sort of like a move away from this massive sort of building in infantry divisions, things like that were so prominent in World War I and II. You have a sort of like more high-tech, Kyle, this will probably interest you since you're writing your paper on this, sort of like this new look military, more reliance on technology, stealth bombers, things like that. Here's the U-2, the stealth bomber that's invented, which can sort of stay off of other, say the Russians' radar or whatever. You have the CIA becoming much more prominent during this time period. So rather than the Americans sending a whole military force to these hotspots around the world, you can just basically send saboteurs, such as the CIA, to do sort of covert, like proxy type of military intervention. You have the sort of flowering of the military-industrial complex during this time period, and you see in like Aviation Week these ads for new jets. This one made by Grumman. Popular Science is a magazine that also has these ads for the military during this time period. And I'll show you a television ad for Grumman, which I think is pretty interesting.
How shrooms changed my life. I used to drink a lot of coffee, and I got honest with myself. Coffee.
Half the fun for Dad at Christmas time is sneaking the kids' presents into the house. There, he made it. Or so he thinks. The scouts are on watch these days, eyes and ears wide open. Around the nation, other eyes and ears are open too, in the serious business of defense. On guard every minute of the day and night throughout the year, including Christmas, the components of our continental air defense system are on constant alert. Alert, strong and ready, hoping and working hard to keep peace on earth. The wish at the heart of every Christmas.
All right, so yeah, I mean, you get from that ad sort of a sense of the cross commercialization of Christmas that continues all through this era in American history, while also sort of conflating the military allows you to celebrate Christmas. Remember, during this time period, communists are being depicted as godless and sort of like the antithesis of Christian values. So you sort of get that conflation in that video, sort of like the celebration of Christmas with the so-called peacekeepers or war makers, whatever you want to call them. I want to show you just a quick bit from Ike's farewell address, where he warns about this sort of like militarization of society. He's very sort of reticent about what's happening to the country as he leaves office.
My fellow Americans, this evening I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell, and to share a few final thoughts with you, my countrymen. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development. Yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
All right, so it's important to think of consumerism and the militarization of American society in the second half of the 20th century. It's two sides of the same coin, just like it's important to think of the Cold War and Civil Rights era as two sides of the same coin. We'll talk about sort of the fear that people had about subliminal advertising and manipulation on Thursday. But one of the things that really created this fear that, like, you know, people are always out there watching you was the Russians launching Sputnik, a spy satellite, in 1957. This leads to the creation of NASA in 1958. Werner von Braun, anybody know who this guy is? Go ahead.
He was the designer of the V-2 rocket who was brought over to the US and is a part of Operation Paperclip, where a lot of prominent former Nazis were brought over as scientists to the United States. And he eventually designed, I think, the Saturn rocket at NASA.
Yeah, exactly. So he was Hitler's primary, what's the word I'm looking for, Sam? The rocket scientist, I guess is the best way of putting it. Yeah, so he's Hitler's best rocket scientist. He flees, he basically has a choice of either going to Russia or the US, and you know, it was an easy choice for him to make. And the Americans were happy to sort of like employ him in the NASA program. But this guy, Yuri Gagarin, a Russian, is the first man in space to beat the Americans. But it really, Sputnik and Gagarin making it to space set up the space race all through the 1960s. You have Kennedy, of course, in 1960, promising to get man to the moon in a decade. And as we talked about a couple weeks ago, this is considered the affluent but also anxious society. And there really is a new affluence for millions of Americans. A lot of it's rooted in the Fair Deal, which is Truman's sort of expansion of the New Deal, FDR's New Deal. He establishes a second Bill of Rights, which every American has a right to, essentially a job, an adequate wage and decent living, a decent home, medical care, economic protection during sickness, accident, old age or unemployment, and a good education. So really sort of like a shoring up of the social safety net that was created during the New Deal. The GI Bill is a really prominent bill that's passed, which is specifically geared towards helping military personnel transition into civilian life. You can see sort of like, you know, free school, job assistance, farm aid, etc. During this time period, you have a real sort of exodus out of the Rust Belt. What we mean by the Rust Belt is sort of the old industrial heartland stretching through the Great Lakes region and then out through the rest of the country, the Sun Belt, as it were, the sort of like warmer areas of the country. One of the things that makes the mass population of these sort of warmer climates is the industrialization of the air conditioner, which becomes widely available for pretty cheap. You can see in this ad, it's sort of blurry, but you can see just the drain. West Virginia, Arkansas lose population. Florida's population grows by 78%. Arizona by 73%, Nevada by 78%, and then California by 48%. But the population of California grows significantly. It already had a lot of people there, but millions more go there. And California really comes to the center of American society in terms of culture, politics, etc. And you can see the country becomes more urban during this time period too. Even places that are losing population by state are becoming more urban. You can see Tampa grows by 125%, San Francisco by 24%, Oakland by 121%, San Diego. So again, you have this transition from a rural society to a real urban society. Nixon, who was the governor of California, as I said, becomes vice president. A lot of the reason why Eisenhower picked him is because California was becoming so central to American politics. Reagan becomes governor of California in '64. and the fact that they're sort of like the two preeminent conservative figures of American politics of the post-war era through the 20th century, I should say, should give you an indication of how central California is to American culture and politics. Now, you also have a militarization of the West and South. You can see just the clustering of air bases in the post-war period. So the military is really sort of like becoming a monoculture in American society. And of course, anywhere military base is built, it's like a whole town grows around it. But McDonald's, drive-in movie theaters, things like that. And here you see a clustering of just all of the military bases. This would be the 4 branches. The Air Force doesn't exist until after the post-war period too. It's like a new branch of the military. You can see military spending through the 20th century. So here's World War I essentially. And then here's the post-war era. This drastic spike right here is World War II. But of course, like all through the 20th century, like military spending never sort of like, it constantly dwarfs what it was during World War I, which should give you some perspective on just how much money is being spent in the military. You can see by 2008, the amount that the US spends on military compared to the rest of the world. So like basically more than the rest of the world combined. Now you can see in terms of how much the US taxpayer dollar goes to militarism and war compared to healthcare, housing, and education. So it dwarfs all of those essentially. And you get these ad campaigns during the post-war period where you have, I showed you that AMP ad a couple weeks ago where you have the soldier in his Navy uniform sort of like at the AMP store, the supermarket. But this community, the finest silver plates, they have this whole ad campaign where it's just sort of like guys in military, this sort of suburban ideal of a young couple sort of setting out in life. With just the prominence of the military in advertising, such as Coke campaigns. Here's Monsanto, which is a chemical and plastics manufacturer. So you really get this sort of ethos of the American soldier being central to advertising during this time period. There's also new commercials to try to recruit people into the Air Force and other armed services. So I'll give you a sense of what those look like.
On foreign shores or at home, where you go by your wings, you'll be known.
Yes, by these wings, you'll be known. You'll be recognized throughout the world as one of America's Knights of the Sky, an Air Force pilot. If you are single between 19 and 26 and a half, you can join this chosen few. You'll train as an aviation cadet and graduate a lieutenant, earning more than $5,000 a year. Win silver wings to a golden future. Fly with the aviation cadet.
Making a trail in the sky, riding the gale way up high. We fly the jet on the Air Force team, the sky cadet, with wings a gleam. Sign up today, go the Air Force way, go up with the aviation cadet.
See your nearest Air Force recruiter now.
Yeah, so sort of like a cartoon, probably aimed towards like kids in particular. But you also have during this time period suburbanization. You see this General Electric ad, which you can see the guy in his uniform with his young bride, presumably, but also sort of like building a little Levitt type of house there. So again, you get this conflation of suburbia, the militarization, and consumerism all sort of like blended together. So just a few facts about American suburbanization. Levitt homes sold for nearly $8,000 in 1947, which would be like $67,000, $68,000 today. The federal government encouraged suburbanization of the U.S. with Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration loans, featuring modest down payments and reasonable interest rates. By 1955, suburban planned communities accounted for 75% of new housing. And by 1960, more Americans lived in suburbs than in cities, and more than 1/4 of the nation's housing stock was less than 10 years old. So this cigarette ad here, you get a sense of sort of like it's selling this Levitt suburbanization as well. And then on the right, you can see what the housing plan would be. Here's the time life. They had a whole expose, or not expose, but feature story about the sort of proliferation of Levitt towns. Suburbanization. You can see just moving vans like stretched out as far as the eye can see. These were like tract homes. built in places like New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Florida, often swampland. So this sort of like mass bulldozing of the landscape was really bad for the environment in a lot of instances too. So it's important to think about sort of Rachel Carson, how she's becoming central to the new environmentalism. One of the things that she's concerned about is this rampant destruction of the landscape to build these new planned communities. And of course, strip malls show up everywhere, where military bases are, suburbs are, strip malls follow. This is the guy, William Levitt, who sort of designed these cookie cutter homes, as it were. Another thing that coincides with the late years of the Eisenhower administration, which is fueling this suburbanization, this mass exodus out of the city, is the Interstate and Defense Highway Act, which was passed in 1956. It was the largest public works program in American history and facilitated the growth of suburbs and the complex of industries that sustain them, including military bases. So you get a sense from this, just the proliferation of these highway systems, essentially connecting one military base to the other. So you can send like planes, tanks, etc., from one military base to the other. But of course, as we looked at a couple weeks ago, people are able to hit the road in their car to sort of visit new tourist destinations as well. So just like civil rights and the Cold War, two sides of the same coin, and consumerism and militarization are two sides of the same coin, suburbanization is one side of the coin to urban decline too. So there's this thing called white flight, which becomes a colloquial term, but it's perceptions of the inner city as crumbling, dangerous, and depressed fueled suburbanization, where you have sort of white folks who are able to get out of the city, and it leaves sort of like the inner city to be left by people who can afford to live there, namely racial minorities. Shelley v. Kramer, the Supreme Court rules in 1948 that racial covenants are unconstitutional, but they still exist because the law is not really enforced. So what we mean by racial covenants is, as these white people are getting out of the city, they're really conscious of what their property values are. So they're basically established as all white communities. So you can see like a lot of times they would be called exclusive, but everyone knew that exclusive meant racially exclusive. So you can see all these sort of ads for these new neighborhoods where it's basically saying like white buyers only. This one, Pasadena. There's one from Atlantic City. And on the right, there would be like a whole separate neighborhood where Black folks could live if they wanted. And this one's Seattle. What we think of today as a very sort of progressive, liberal city. They also have racial covenants. So I'll show you just a quick bit about the lasting impact of racial covenants.
Real cowboys customize and save with Liberty Mutual.
It's someone else take a turn.
Friends would walk up to me and just be like, "What the f is in your mug?" And I would just tell them it's mud.
Normally these ads would bother me, but like in an advertising class, it seems to make perfect sense, you know?
And if there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out. One of the main reasons was because it was a white community. And we understood that it was going to be all white. We were very happy to buy a home here.
This was Levittown, Pennsylvania, shortly after World War II, in a suburb that explicitly promised a white-only neighborhood. And it wasn't some outlier. It was the prototypical suburb built by the father of suburbia, Bill Levitt, who created several suburbs around the US, all named Levittown. But one reason Levitt wanted a white-only community was because the US government was subsidizing it, and that's what they wanted. They said they didn't want racially inharmonious groups, lowering property values. That's why Levitt didn't just sell cookie-cutter houses. He sold a meticulously crafted, affordable, utopian lifestyle. So as the courts integrated public spaces like schools, more and more white people fled to these suburbs. And these patterns are still the defining characteristic of America's racial geography. But we now...
All right, so remember we talked about what did the MAGA crowd mean when they said like, make America great again? Remember, like we sort of settled on this era in American history. And this whole notion that like white supremacy or racism is something that exists in the mind of like paranoid schizophrenic white folks, it's sort of like off the mark. Like this is like baked into American consumer culture. But again, like as I've said so many times before throughout the semester, things get worse at the same time, but things get better at the same time. So you have during the 50s a real sort of like a deeply rooted civil rights movement taking shape. You can see that from this map, just the mass exodus of African Americans from the South during World War II. They're primarily going to what's today considered the Rust Belt, the industrial heartland around the Great Lakes states, where the sort of hotbed of American industrialization is. But it's, you know, a lot of times they're being pulled out of the South for war work, but also there's the invention of the international harvester cotton picker, which is able to do the job of 20 sharecroppers essentially. So as white landowners in the South are able to buy these machines, they no longer need sharecroppers. So the sharecroppers are sort of like pushed, you know, they're not able to make a living anymore. So they're forced to go to sort of like places like Detroit, Akron, Trenton, wherever to find work. So you also have, as African Americans are moving out of the country, the sort of like nationalization of race is taking place, which I think the suburbanization throughout the country is an example of. But this guy's sign is really interesting to me because when we read Cohen and Chambers, they both talk about these sort of like consumerist movements, these like don't shop where you can't work movements. So this would be an example of that, but also this guy's saying that segregation is anti-American. And as we'll see in a couple minutes, the people who are segregationists are conflating American values with segregation. So you have this like competition between like what are American values that's rooted all the way back in sort of the founding of the nation as, you know, all men are created equal, but like as Jefferson saying all men are created equal, he's also holding slaves. And that tension is what really drives American identity all through the early decades of American, the early centuries, I should say, of American history. So it's impossible to underscore the importance of Black vets. You have these really heroic African Americans going to Asia and Europe to fight in a segregated army against the Nazis in particular, who are devout racists, unapologetic racists. And there's this double V campaign that the NAACP creates. The whole notion is to fight fascism abroad and racism at home. And what they're hoping is that the heroic efforts of African Americans to risk life and limb will expose more Americans to their sort of like own embedded biases towards African Americans at home. There's a couple flashpoints. In 1946, George Dorsey and his wife are lynched. They're tied to a tree and shot, numerous times with bullets. George Dorsey was wearing his uniform at the time. You have Medgar Evers try to register African Americans to vote in Mississippi, his home state, and he's murdered for doing so. This is an interesting ad, I think. Anyone know what this building is? Good.
The United Nations.
Yeah, exactly. So the United Nations building. So you get this sort of United Airlines ad that's featuring the United Nations. So what is the United Nations?
A place where all governments of the world go and discuss problems of society.
Yeah, and it's sort of like a world governing body, and it was designed to sort of like create alliances in the hopes of preventing another World War I or another World War II. But at the UN in 1948, W.E.B. Du Bois, who's the founder of the NAACP, gives a rousing speech in which he says, the problem for African Americans is not so much Russia, it's Mississippi. And of course, Nina Simone has a very famous song called Everybody Knows About Mississippi, Goddamn, which she sort of seconds the sentiment of Du Bois. In 1946, you have the integration of the NFL. These are the first four guys to integrate the NFL. You have Jackie Robinson, who was a war hero. He's actually court-martialed when he's in the service for refusing to move to the back of the bus. So he's brought in front of a court-martial trial. He defends himself really eloquently, and he's ultimately given an honorable discharge rather than a dishonorable discharge. But he sort of becomes like a cause célèbre as a result. You have Robinson finally integrates the major leagues in 1947. Roy Campanella integrates soon after Robinson for the Brooklyn Dodgers. In 1948, you have A. Philip Randolph, who's the head of the sleeping car porters, yeah, which is a really powerful labor union at the time. He basically says that if the government doesn't really get behind forceful civil rights legislation, that he'll call a strike amongst the sleeping car porters. And if that would have happened, they would have shut down the railroads, which would have essentially shut down the American economy. So not because Truman is necessarily an integrationist, or that he really cares about sort of integration too much. His hand is sort of forced to pass Executive Order 9981, which integrates the armed forces. So for the first time in American history, other than the Revolutionary War, you have black soldiers and white soldiers fighting side by side. So in 1954, you have the federal government end segregation of public schools. So you'll recall in 1896, hopefully, there's that Plessy v. Ferguson. The Supreme Court rules that separate is equal. In 1954, that ruling is reversed in the Brown versus Board of Education case. So Thurgood Marshall is one of the head lawyers fighting on behalf of the NAACP to sort of blow up this notion that separate is equal. As Kira and Isla pointed out a couple weeks ago, the Kenneth Clark doll experiment was, Kenneth Clark was a sociologist. He showed all of these little black kids mostly these two dolls, and he basically asked them like which one is prettier or more attractive, and all of them said the white doll. And this sort of blew up the notion that separate was equal. The Supreme Court ruled that obviously like these kids have been like taught that white is sort of like a higher thing because white folks tend to go to much better schools. Black people are forced to live in poor sections of town, and of course, since public schools are funded by your taxes, there would be less tax dollars going to black schools. So this is one of the main sort of things that the Supreme Court said, like, okay, like Thurgood Marshall's right. And again, just like that placard that I showed you of the kid a couple minutes ago saying that segregation is un-American, you see these types of people. This is in Little Rock in 1957. They're sort of saying that race mixing is communism, showing up with their American flag. So again, it's sort of this competition to decide like what exactly are American values and identity. This is the Little Rock 9 here. They integrated Little Rock Central High School, which was a very difficult time for them, as you can imagine. Students and their parents would come out to sort of harass the kids as they're going to school and leaving school. The National Guard had to be called in to escort the kids to and from classes. Here's Orville Faubus. He's the governor of this guy right here, the governor of Arkansas. He's essentially arguing that this is a massive overreach by the federal government and that states should have the right to determine how they live and the values that they have. Of course, you see like the Confederate flag showing up at all of these things as well. This is an interesting picture from Little Rock during the time. You can see that communists infiltrated our churches. Now it integrates our schools. I think this is like really fun because like you just know that you messed up spelling it and had to put that tape over it to fix it. So you can see here too this like classic trope, sort of like white supremacy, that you have to protect the white women from these like brutes. So I wondered too, like what does you can see at the bottom of the sign, it says 2 Peter 2 through 1 and 2. And I wondered like what exactly is that? And it's but these people blaspheme in matters they don't understand. They are unreasoning animals, creatures of instinct, born only to be caught and destroyed. And like animals, they too will perish. So you get a sense of how like these Christians are sort of like cloaking their white supremacy in Christianity, which is I think the opposite of what Jesus would have wanted of them. But also you get Earl Warren, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Of course, he's painted as a communist. Anyone who was sort of like in favor of civil rights during this time period, a lot of times they would be, painted as red or communist. You get this billboard that pops up across the country with Martin Luther King supposedly at a communist school. It's actually like a Bible training class for ministers, but I guess segregationists don't care about that too much. MLK, of course, is the sort of champion of nonviolent resistance. He was largely influenced by Henry David Thoreau. Mahatma Gandhi, who fought the British Empire from the 20s through the 40s with nonviolent tactics as well. And the whole point of sort of like showing up and like violating laws that were amoral or unjust was to sort of get yourself arrested. Here's Rosa Parks, her mugshot, E.D. Nixon's mugshot, Martin Luther King's mugshot. So essentially the whole tactic was just to show up and like break laws that were not just laws, to sort of expose people to how unjust American laws can be. The whole notion of the whole world is watching, you would often hear people saying that at these, chanting them at these protests. And again, here's people just sitting at a counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and sort of the segregationists like dumping things on them, spitting on them. And all of these pictures are being beamed all throughout the world. Remember, this is an anti-colonialist moment in American history where these are being beamed into people's sort of living rooms all around the world. Again, these images were, it's impossible to underscore how powerful these images were in terms of like people sitting in their suburban homes in like different parts of the country. The news is showing this, or they're seeing this in the newspaper, and they're pretty ambivalent about race relations, but these types of images really sort of like turn the tide in terms of getting more adherence onto sort of like the winning side, so to speak. So this is in Birmingham, Alabama. This is during the Children's Crusade. Basically, these kids were, Martin Luther King and others sort of convinced them to sort of walk out of school and just basically peacefully protest. Of course, Will Connor calls out the dogs and the fire hoses. And again, these are being beamed, like these images are being seen all throughout the world. And again, this is a decolonialist moment in American history. A lot of these people would be particularly sympathetic to what's happening to Black people, and sort of like there's this like image, this public relations campaign between the Americans and Russians to try to like win these people over. And so I'll show you just really quick some Soviet propaganda or public relations, I guess it would be called by Bernays.
Oto Ameryka. Wystawę pod takim tytułem zwiedzają w Warszawie dziesiątki tysięcy osób. W cieniu posągu wolności policyjna pałka. W kraju wolności miliony ludzi poza prawem. Co czeka tego obywatela wolnego kraju? Widmo Ku Klux Klanu. Stryczek zanurzony ręką amerykańskich faszystów. Jest wolność w tym kraju dla samosądów i lynczów.
So, and there's still a real prominent sort of like degradation, I guess you could say, of African Americans in these types of ads. They're still very prominent, this Aunt Jemima type of thing. But you also have a segregation of American consumer markets where you have Ebony magazine becomes very popular. This is Sugar Ray Robinson here and his family. Has anybody seen Raging Bull? Scorsese's Raging Bull? Yeah, so this is the guy who's like constantly beating the shit out of Jake LaMotta. This is the real version of him. You have Jet magazine becomes very popular amongst African Americans too. You still have these types of ads too for like skin bleaching cream, even after the Kenneth Clark doll experiments. But you also have, you might recall in earlier lectures, we talked about and readings how African Americans were almost never seen as consumers. Through the 1950s, you do get African Americans being depicted as consumers, which I guess you could say is a sign of progress, even if it's for products that are harmful for you, like Ken cigarettes and Coca-Cola. But again, you sort of like get this slow, halting progress in the realm of advertisements, which is essentially what the subject of Chambers' article is. So let's discuss Chambers' civil rights in the advertising industry for a bit. All right, so first question. Chambers argued that advertisements provided Blacks with a daily reminder of what? Go ahead, Anna.
It says just how deeply their second, if not third class citizenship ran. So it was just like further degrading them, the roles that were I guess, provided were incredibly racist and didn't offer them any like real representation.
Yeah, right. So you recall hopefully that like when we talked about Marchand's social tableau before the midterm, it was all about like ads were meant to give people sort of like a goal that they could reach out and touch, or like some sort of like aspirational type of thing to them. Chambers is saying that throughout most of the 1950s, ads were not giving African Americans any type of sort of thing to aspire to. Go ahead.
That's because they didn't want to either. Because the advertise, like they didn't want, because like everybody, was kind of like, because we don't want to advertise to the African Americans, so we're not going to give them any, we're just not going to give them anything, we don't like them, so like we're not going to give them, something they can look up to.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I think Chambers also says that as Black Americans started to become more affluent, that white advertisers would misidentify their desire for luxury goods and other like trappings of middle class as a desire to emulate whiteness, when in reality it was just a desire to be middle class.
Yeah, exactly. That's you got ahead of me. That's one of the questions. So well done. You checked two boxes with one answer. Well done. All right, so here's what I got for it. So advertisements were a constant reminder of forced exclusion of African Americans from areas of American life. What opportunities and choices were available. So while the ubiquity of advertisements made them below the conscious view of most whites, to Blacks they were a constant reminder of the status in America, something no Cadillac or a bottle of expensive Scotch could erase. All right, so question 2, what did civil rights activists in the 1950s want ads to be? Go ahead.
They just wanted Black people to be.
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah. What else? So like back to the aspirational aspect, right? Like they want African Americans to sort of like see images of themselves that do lead to further aspiration. All right, so here's what I got. Activists wanted ads to be tools in the larger fight against racism and discrimination. The pressure on the advertising industry to employ more Blacks in agencies would help activists fulfill the goal of placing Blacks in responsible white-collar positions with the power to influence change. Simultaneously, pressure on the industry for integrated advertisements would both feature Blacks as a visible part of the consumer landscape and help change the negative and pejorative images of them held by some in the larger society. All right, so the National Urban League, Congress of Racial Equality, and National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which are the focus of the essay, all worked to do what?
To fight for equal rights.
Yeah, that's the broad way of saying it, but any specifics?
Like they were trying to get paid equally, or maybe like trying to get into the workforce properly without not besides the war, like they were trying to get into the workforce. They wanted to pay for their own bills, for their own homes. Like they just wanted equal pay, and they wanted to be treated as the average white person.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I think they want equal consideration in terms of employment, both for employment at all, and also for in terms of positions. And also they want equal treatment as customers and consumers from shops and restaurants.
Yeah. So I think the most succinct way of saying it is greater representation and the sort of whole scope of American society, in the hopes that that representation would lead to a more sort of substantive reality in terms of workplace employment. Here's what I got. Expand employment opportunities and create a visible change in the way advertisements incorporated Black models. Additionally, each group places strong emphasis on the creation of racially integrated advertisements and media directed at the general market. All right, so I think this is what Sam got. So during the 1950s, Chambers argues, what did many ad agencies assume about African Americans? Sam?
That they wanted to, that they aspired to whiteness. Basically.
Right, exactly. And what did Black consumer activism force advertisers to confront, Sam?
That they basically just aspired to affluence and the trappings of the middle class.
Right, it didn't really have so much to do with race, it had to do more with class. So, all right, so by 1960, how were African Americans depicted in mainstream media? according to Chambers? Better, worse?
Maybe a little bit of both, like a little bit better and worse. Like they started to be, I mean, worse by maybe racism was still around, but better, like they were starting to get the respect that they deserve a little bit. And interesting fact about both readings, I compared them to the movie Hidden Figures because the movie is about African American women working at NASA, and they're comparing. It's not just about equality, but it was about like trying to get the first man to, like we were discussing earlier, to space and a whole bunch of stuff. But like they had to run the numbers in order to make the launch work perfectly. And I figured with both readings, I figured that made perfect sense from the movie. If you ever seen it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a good connection for sure. Go ahead.
I found in the reading where it says the advertising industry had ceased using most of the pejorative and derogatory images that had been popular in the early portion of the century, but rather than featuring more realistic images of blacks, the industry simply eliminated blacks from most of the advertisements in mainstream media, rendering them invisible. So it's kind of like they didn't want to show them, and then I'm assuming that is the paragraph that I was just reading.
Yeah, exactly. Well done.
Oh, goody.
Yeah, so is this like just taking them out of ads rather than sort of like having to deal with the controversy surrounding like integrating them or depicting them as like porters or whatever, like as pancake makers or whatever? Like, is that a sign of societal progress or? Yeah.
Absolutely not. I think it even says that it perpetuates the belief that it perpetuates the belief that blacks are not equal to whites. Like the idea that because black people aren't being represented in media, and just because they're no longer using these incredibly derogatory images doesn't mean that it's progress at all. It means that white people got too uncomfortable trying to come up with something and they didn't think it was worthwhile. I don't think that that's progress at all. I think it makes it far, far worse.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you still very much see that in American society nowadays, where it's like corporations, they just don't want anything controversial. It's like, I mean, I think a big reason why this will hopefully resonate with you football fans is like, I think a big reason why Tim Tebow was like sort of like taken out of the league was part of the same reason that Kaepernick was, is that like these are brands, they're companies, and at the end of the day, they just don't want controversy. So like, whether it's Tim Tebow taking a knee or Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, like they don't want to offend anyone, so they'd rather just sort of like take you out of the whole spectrum, so to speak. All right, so question 6. Chambers argued that advertising, if used appropriately, could do what?
It could present to blacks an image of the United States that not only included them, but also welcomed them to become a part of the national life. And that's exactly what it says right there.
Reading.
Yeah, but just to add on to it, advertising could improve both the white majority's image of blacks and blacks' image of themselves. Well done. You've really stepped your game up. I appreciate that. All right. So
I actually started looking through the PowerPoint, like as you were going through the questions, I brought it up on here and I'm like, oh wait, I can actually look through and start finding this stuff.
Well done. All right, so just looking ahead to Thursday, the topics will be, are we being manipulated and does sex sell? Which I think fits into the sort of like the Cold War theme, because people are very sort of paranoid about their minds being controlled by others, and sort of sex becomes much more central to ads in the 50s and 60s. So make sure that you read Green and O'Barr. So we've got about 10 more minutes. So why don't you guys look for primary, secondary sources, or if you need to sort of like work through or troubleshoot some of your ideas with me, I'm happy to take some questions. But also let me pass around this book really quick, which I think does a good job of blending secondary and primary sources. It's Pamela Pencock's Advertising Sin and Sickness. The scope of her argument is that in the 1950s, religious groups sought to outlaw alcohol and tobacco marketing. In the 1960s, consumer activists take the helm in an effort to ban alcohol advertising and label tobacco as dangerous to consumers' health. In the 1970s and 80s, secular and scientific arguments came to dominate policy debates. And the controversy over alcohol marketing during the 70s and 80s highlighted the issues of substance abuse, public health, and consumer rights. But our ultimate conclusion is that there's a deep cultural ambivalence in American society about consumerism and private enterprise, morality and health, scientific authority, and legitimate regulation of commercial speech. So this is her book. So if you just want to flip through it and sort of like see some of the primary sources that she used, and if you look in the footnotes, you can see some of the secondary sources she used. So anyone want to sort of give me their idea, maybe do a bit of troubleshooting about, you know, your primary and secondary sources. Of course, you have an assignment due on Thursday. Primary sources. So does everyone have a topic yet? Okay. Anyone not have a topic? Okay, go ahead, Dan.
Oh, I was gonna ask you because I was obviously talking about the Untitled Chapter that's used in video game ads to see if they sell along with that.
Yeah.
Actually, like how I talk about the elephants and all that.
Yeah. I actually saw, you know who Madison Cawthorn is?
I do not.
He's a congressman from North Carolina. I saw an ad of his where he talks about simps, like that his opponent is a simp, and that like voting for him is like not a vote for a simp. Let me see if I can find it. Go ahead, keep talking.
So when I was at the archives last Thursday, it was Thursday, no, Tuesday, Tuesday. I was recommended to look at the Mad magazines to look at everything that's there.
Yeah.
And everything. So I was gonna ask you, is it okay if I use like a YouTube video as a primary
Yeah,
source?
of course. Yeah, as long as you cite it.
Oh, okay, that's something.
Yeah, I mean, we'll look at the end of the semester some video game ads. Like Game Boy has like a really strange ad of this like girl tied up to a bed, and you can see like a guy's hand, like the Game Boy down the lower screen, and it says like it's that distracting. That might be like interesting to look at. There's like a Stevie Wonder one where he's basically saying like if I could play video games, I'm sure I would play Atari. So it's like video games become like very sort of like the whole point of video games is to appeal to like teenage boys, so they want to sort of be like as like edgy and like, you know, crude as possible.
Win at work by communicating effectively with Grammarly. Meet Todd. He is being
It's rhetorical. I don't care and I won't learn. I just think that it's weird that the only two
because they don't want people who are going to stand up.
Did before, when obviously
Better than any socialist simp
ads.
Did you hear? My opponent is a simp. He endorsed Nancy Pelosi right here in Western North Carolina. I will endorse Nancy Pelosi. I'll make her life a living hell. I believe you can run your life better than I can, better than any socialist simp Congress can. I'm Madison Cawthorn. I'm not a socialist. I'm not a simp. I am your weapon. Send me to Congress to fight for you.
Okay. I don't know how many times the word simp should appear in a campaign ad, but I don't think it's 3. And now that I've said it out loud, more than 0 is clearly too many. And for the record, since his election, Cawthorn has shown much less interest in fighting for his constituents than in shameless self-promotion, reportedly telling colleagues he built his staff around comms rather than legislation, which absolutely makes sense because this guy loves posting shots of himself on Instagram, whether he's fishing, smoking cigars, or in a post that's now been deleted, visiting Hitler's vacation house known as the Eagle's Nest, in which his caption refers to Hitler as the Fuhrer and says the site has been on his bucket list for a while and did not disappoint. And look, I know it's not the worst thing, but there was also this photo captioned, "Getting crazy with some apple cobbler made right over the smoke." And I don't know what that is, but it is definitely not a cobbler. It doesn't have a biscuit or a pie-dough topping. It's not a buckle because I don't see a cake base with a streusel topping. If he was throwing it on a stovetop, he could try and call it a grunge, but it just isn't one. It's not an apple brown Betty. It's not a crisp. And if you're calling that a sonker, you're dead fucking wrong, my friend. It basically looks like someone grated a medium-sized baby into a skillet. That's nothing. That's fucking nothing, Madison. Words mean things.
Do you guys watch John Oliver?
I do not.
He's a genius.
Question about the paper. What's the difference between so this week is primary sources, next week is secondary sources. Can we use some of the reading things for secondary?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think it's like interchangeable. If you wanted to do secondary sources this week or like a bit of both, like that's fine with me. I mean, it just depends on.
Well, secondary is like looking at someone else looking at it, and the primary is someone looking directly.
Yeah, so like the primary source would be just the ad itself, and then like so like here's an example that we just looked at. So the primary source would be the Madison Cawthorn ad. The secondary source would be John Oliver, sort of like referencing the ad. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say for mine, I have a source that I found like that has an ad inside of it that I want to use as one of my ads that I want to focus on, but then it's like inside of a secondary source. So can I still do that?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, good. Go ahead.
My topic for like the primary source of is on like race during the Civil War movements, and I found an interesting ad that they call this title Slack Power. It's like Black Power, but it's about like an African American wearing pants, and like and showing that it's like these are the professional workers. So Slack Power is like Black Power.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm doing Air Jordan advertisements and what they say about America during the 80s. Would a primary source, could it be a video on YouTube of like an original ad, or is that a second?
Yeah. As long as you cite it, it's fine. Like anything that the company is using to sort of like market stuff would be the primary source. But like, have you looked in JSTOR for? There's tons of stuff on Jordan there. Like I saw like the Church of Jordan looks like an interesting article.
I looked at the ones at the Duke University libraries. And
Hartman.
most of the things that were popping up were like in Chinese. It was weird. I don't know why.
Yeah, so check out JSTOR. Like the Church of Jordan is basically arguing that like consumerism became religion in the 80s, and like Michael Jordan is like the paragon of that, which I think would be really useful to see. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure if my topic was viable. I was sending you some emails about it, but it was how the commodification of Black boxers reflected the reality of the time.
Yeah.
Do you think that's?
I think that's a good sort of like starting point. I'm just wondering like what sources you use on it.
Well, I found 3 that I got from JSTOR.
Rodin has a book too, like $40 Million Slaves, I think it's called, something like that. It's a book. They might have it at the library, but I think James is his first name, but Rodin, so like RHODEN.
William
Rodin.
Yeah.
Is the title of the book $40 Million Slaves?
Yeah, the rise and fall of redemption of.
That'll be a really good source for you. Like he has a chapter in there on like Jack Johnson. So I mean, if you're going to sort of like start with like boxers, you sort of have to start with Jack Johnson. Showed as like an evolution through the 20th century from like Ali to Tyson. Joe
I couldn't
Lewis.
find like anything on Mike Tyson, but I found stuff on.
I think there might be, if I remember correctly, check the table of contents in that, but he might have a chapter on Tyson as well. I know he does on Jordan, so you might want to check that out too, Gio.
Do you think I should spread it out further instead of just focusing on boxers?
I don't know. Like you're going to sort of your sources will ultimately dictate it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I was just wondering, are you going to comment on our like research question to make sure it's like?
Yeah, I mean, like if I think it needs like sort of like refinement or like narrowing, I mean that's sort of like the whole point of these next two assignments is just to sort of like make sure that you're on the right track. Okay. Isla, did you have something?
Yeah, but I was going to talk to you about it after because it's a lot more stuff that we talk about.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think it's about that time. I'll see you guys on Thursday. Yes. So the primary sources for that are obviously more than the secondary sources.
I think I might want to do just like general science fiction and advertising.
Okay, I mean, I wonder if also you might be about like biography, sure. We'll have them.
Sorry, I had too much visual.
I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to, it's just to sort of like give you a general idea. What is your idea?
My idea was to talk about
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a viable topic. It doesn't have to be sort of like about stuff in history, it can be like.
Why? What happened? What happened? Whoa.
Just any sort of the native advertising, like these videos that pop up as I'm showing you videos, the whole point of them is to like sort of like get you to pay attention right away, as opposed to like old ads that used to be like a minute long or like 30 seconds long. These ads are essentially trying to sort of like get you the message in the first 5 seconds, because chances are you're going to click like skip to whatever. So they really have to like grab you by the throat.
So would you
I mean, like I get an ad from like Chuck Schumer all the time, where it's like when I go to YouTube and he's like, hey, I'm talking to you. I need your personal help. And it's like, you're not asking for my personal help. Like this is intended for like millions of people, you know, like ads that sort of like make you think that they're talking just to you and that they need your help. That's like a good example.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
No problem. Well,
so I found this book that you sent me a chapter, and I already had the book. It's called Playing with America's Doll. And you sent me like a review of it, but I bought the book and started reading that. And it's the argument of this book is something that I really want to go into. It's talking about how these dolls sell commodity activism and how it is sort of that's basically just how they sell.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
And so I have been working this out, and I sort of basically like copy and paste the middle and word created into an outline. But so I want to do how does the American Doll brand marketed commodity activism to young girls and to what extent is this activism that's so prevalent?
Yeah.
You think that that's a better one than?
Yeah, but it's like how my question is like, how would you verify how effective the dolls were? I mean, I'm not saying that you can't verify that, but maybe you can. I haven't read the articles, but that would be like my question. It's like,
how do you prove it?
Yeah, exactly.
So the book that I have has a bunch of it. She interviewed parents and the children who own the book dolls, and a lot of the parents are like these affluent white moms who talk about like it's good that they, that these dolls like always do what they believe is right, and so it also sort of goes into like how these like there's a civil rights doll and how she like doesn't do anything that's very radical. She just like makes sure that her playground is as good as the white woman's playground.
Yeah. I mean, that's great. I mean, I think that's what the whole idea behind the Legos ads too, where that I told you about, where it's like little girls building like little scientific projects. It's like this attempt to sort of like get girls interested in science, technology, engineering, and math, because that's usually like a male-dominated field. So yeah, I mean, I think that it all sounds really good. Yeah, it sounds like it's a gradual level project. So, yeah. No worries. I'll see you on Thursday.
See you.
The week.